The moment I turned onto Maple Grove Lane in my quiet subdivision outside Charlotte, North Carolina, I knew something was catastrophically wrong because my house looked naked against the afternoon sky where there should have been a canopy of green. I slammed on the brakes so hard my truck skidded slightly on the asphalt. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at my property in disbelief. The 4 massive oak trees that had stood sentinel in my front yard for probably a century were gone. Not trimmed, not pruned, gone. Stumps remained where majestic trunks had been, and my lawn looked like a war zone covered in sawdust, wood chips, and tire tracks from heavy equipment. I threw the truck into park right there in the middle of the street and jumped out, my hands shaking with rage and confusion. My name is James Erikson, and I had lived in this house for 6 years. Those trees were one of the main reasons I bought the property in the first place. They provided shade that kept my energy bills reasonable, gave privacy from the street, and were just beautiful pieces of living history. A pile of logs and branches sat stacked along my driveway. I walked around in a daze, looking at the destruction. The backyard was even worse. 3 more oak trees that had shaded my deck and kept my house cool during brutal Carolina summers were reduced to stumps. My Japanese maple that my late mother had given me as a housewarming gift was completely obliterated. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and started taking pictures of everything. The stumps, the debris, the damage to my lawn where heavy machinery had torn up the grass, everything. My mind raced through possibilities. Had there been some kind of emergency I did not know about? A gas leak, power line issue. But no one had called me, and I would have seen something on my Ring doorbell camera. As if reading my mind, I pulled up the Ring app on my phone. I scrolled back through the day's footage and felt my blood pressure spike even higher. At 9 that morning, a tree removal company truck had pulled up. 3 workers got out, followed by a silver Lexus SUV that I recognized immediately. My stomach dropped. That was Patricia Harrington's car. She was the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and she was notorious for being the most insufferable busybody in the entire subdivision. I watched the footage as Patricia, a woman in her late 40s with an aggressive blonde bob and the permanent expression of someone who had just smelled something unpleasant, stood in my yard pointing at my trees while talking to the crew. She was holding what looked like paperwork. The crew started up their chainsaws and I had to stop the video. I could not watch my trees coming down. I immediately called Patricia. The phone rang 4 times before she answered with her sugary fake voice that made my teeth hurt. "James, hello. I was wondering when you would notice." "Notice?" "Patricia, what the hell happened to my trees? Why are there stumps where my oak trees used to be?" "Well, if you had bothered to attend the last 3 HOA meetings, you would know that we have been discussing the neighborhood beautification project. Your trees were completely out of compliance with the updated landscaping guidelines." I felt like my head might explode. "What are you talking about? There was nothing wrong with my trees. They were healthy, mature oaks, and you cannot just cut down someone's trees without permission." "Actually, James, if you read your HOA covenant which you signed when you purchased your home, you would see that the association has the right to maintain community standards. Your trees were blocking the sight lines to your home's facade, which violates Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the beautification standards we passed in March. We sent you 3 notices. I never got any notices, and even if I had, you cannot just trespass on my property and destroy my trees." Patricia's voice turned cold. "We have proof of delivery for all 3 certified letters. You chose to ignore them. The trees have been removed, and you will be receiving a bill for half the cost of removal since the HOA graciously agreed to split the expense with you. That will be $4,500, due within 30 days. I could not even form words. She wanted me to pay for the removal of my own trees that I never authorized. You are out of your mind if you think I am paying a single cent. I am calling the police right now. This is destruction of property. Do what you need to do, James. The HOA has acted within our legal rights. Have a blessed day. She hung up. I immediately dialed 911, then realized this was not exactly an emergency. So I hung up and called the non-emergency line for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department instead. An officer arrived about 40 minutes later, a young guy named Officer Rodriguez who looked fresh out of the academy. He walked around my property, took notes, and listened to my explanation. So you never authorized this tree removal? He asked. Absolutely not. I was at work all day. I am a mechanical engineer at the Boeing facility. I left this morning at 6:30 and my trees were fine. I came home to this. Officer Rodriguez scratched his head. This is tricky. Normally, this would be clear-cut destruction of property. But if the HOA is claiming they had the authority under your covenant agreement, this might be a civil matter rather than criminal. How is this not criminal? They came onto my property without permission and destroyed trees worth thousands of dollars. I understand your frustration, sir. Let me talk to my sergeant. He walked back to his patrol car and spent about 10 minutes on the radio. When he came back, he looked apologetic. My sergeant says this is almost certainly going to have to be handled as a civil dispute. The HOA is claiming they had the legal authority under your housing agreement. You will probably need to get a lawyer and sue them. So they can just do whatever they want and face no consequences. Not no consequences, sir. But the legal consequences will probably come through civil court, not criminal charges. I can file a report for you, which will help document everything, but I cannot arrest anyone today. I felt defeated but knew getting angry at Officer Rodriguez would not help anything. He was just doing his job. Fine. Please file the report. After the officer left, I spent the rest of the evening documenting everything. I took dozens more photos from every angle. I made notes about what trees had been removed, their approximate sizes, and how long they had been there. I went through my email and found absolutely nothing from the HOA about any notices or tree removal. I checked my mailbox and the past several weeks of mail I had stacked on my kitchen counter. Nothing. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and started making phone calls. The first call was to Michael Chen, a real estate attorney whose office was in downtown Charlotte. I had gotten his name from a coworker who had used him for a property dispute. His receptionist scheduled me for an appointment that afternoon. My second call was to an arborist. I found a company called Carolina Tree Specialists with excellent reviews, and I explained my situation to the owner, a man named Robert Davidson. He said he could come out that same day to assess the damage. Robert arrived around 11 in the morning, driving a truck with his company logo. He was a man in his 60s with weathered skin, and the solid build of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life. He spent nearly an hour examining the stumps, taking measurements, and reviewing the photos I had taken before the trees were removed. These were mature water oaks, he said, crouching next to one of the larger stumps in the front yard. This one here was probably 80 to 90 years old based on the ring count, completely healthy too. See here. He pointed to the rings in the wood. No disease, no rot, no pest damage. This was a valuable specimen tree. Can you give me an assessment of what they were worth? Absolutely. That's actually one of my specialties. I testify as an expert witness in cases like this pretty regularly. Trees this size and age have significant value, both in terms of the actual tree value using the trunk formula method and in terms of the property value they added. Plus, there is the cost of replacement, though you can never truly replace a 90-year-old tree. We walked around to the backyard where 3 more oaks had stood. Robert examined each stump carefully, taking notes and photos with his own camera. When we got to where my Japanese maple had been, he shook his head sadly. Japanese maples are not cheap to begin with, and a mature specimen like this was probably 20 years old. These are slow-growing trees. The replacement cost alone would be several $1,000s, and that's not even counting the sentimental value. My mother gave me that tree when I bought this house. She died 3 years ago. Robert put a hand on my shoulder. I am sorry for your loss. Unfortunately, sentimental value does not hold up in court, but everything else will. Give me a few days to put together a comprehensive report. I will document every tree, provide valuation using industry standard methods, and give you a detailed analysis of the property value impact. This report will hold up in court. What are we talking about in terms of total value? Robert was quiet for a moment, still looking at the stumps. Conservatively, you are looking at somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 in total damages. These were significant trees, and they were wrongfully destroyed. The fact that they were healthy and had decades of life left in them increases the value substantially. I felt dizzy. I knew the trees were valuable, but hearing a number that high was shocking. Do you really think I can get that in court? If they truly removed these trees without your permission and without legitimate legal authority? Absolutely. I have testified in dozens of cases like this. Property owners have rights, and trees are considered part of the real property. Destroying them without authorization is a serious matter. We scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following week when he would have his report completed. After Robert left, I headed downtown for my appointment with Michael Chen. His office was in a modern high-rise near the courthouse. Michael was probably in his early 40s, sharply dressed, and had the confident air of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I explained the entire situation while he took notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. First thing I need to see is your HOA covenant and any amendments that have been passed since you purchased the home. Second, I need copies of these alleged notices they claim to have sent you. Third, we need that Arborist report. Once I have all that, I can assess the strength of your case. What do you think my chances are, preliminarily? I think you have a very strong case. HOAs have a lot of power, but they do not have unlimited power. They cannot just destroy property without following proper procedures. If they did not give you adequate notice, if they did not give you a chance to contest the issue, if they exceeded their authority under the covenant, then you have multiple grounds to sue. Plus, the fact that they want you to pay for the removal. That's adding insult to injury. What about criminal charges? Michael shook his head. The police are right that this is almost certainly a civil matter. To pursue criminal charges, you would need to prove criminal intent, and the HOA is going to hide behind their claimed authority under the covenant. But in civil court, you can pursue damages, and based on what you are telling me about the size and age of these trees, we could be talking about substantial damages. The arborist said potentially up to $200,000. Michael's eyebrows went up. If he can support that valuation, and if he is credible on the stand, then yes, we should pursue that. Plus, we can ask for attorney fees and potentially punitive damages if we can prove the HOA acted maliciously or with gross negligence. We spent another 30 minutes going over the details and the next steps. Michael agreed to take my case on a contingency basis, meaning he would get paid a percentage of whatever we recovered. He would handle everything and keep me updated on the progress. I left his office feeling like I finally had someone in my corner who knew how to fight back. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved quickly. Michael sent a demand letter to the HOA threatening legal action if they did not provide compensation for the destroyed trees. The HOA responded through their attorney, a smug letter claiming they had acted within their authority and that I was liable for my portion of the removal costs. They included copies of 3 alleged notices that they claimed had been sent to me via certified mail. I looked at the tracking numbers they provided, and my stomach dropped. The notices showed as delivered, but I had never received them. I called the post office, and after being transferred 3 times, I finally got someone who could look up the delivery records. The supervisor I spoke with confirmed that all 3 certified letters had been signed for by someone named Sarah Martinez. I do not know anyone by that name, I told Michael when I called him with this information. Let me do some digging. 2 days later, Michael called me back. Sarah Martinez works for the HOA management company. She is an administrative assistant. It looks like the HOA had all the notices sent to their own office and had their own employee sign for them. Then they simply never actually forwarded them to you. That's fraud. It absolutely is, and it strengthens our case considerably. They did not act in good faith. They intentionally circumvented the notice requirement. While Michael worked on preparing our lawsuit, I did some investigating of my own. I started talking to my neighbors, many of whom I had only exchanged waves with over the years. I knocked on doors up and down Maple Grove Lane and the surrounding streets, asking people about their experiences with the HOA and specifically with Patricia Harrington. What I learned made my blood boil. Patricia had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years. My next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Frank Morrison, told me that Patricia had tried to force him to remove his vegetable garden because it was not in compliance with landscaping standards. She had sent him threatening letters and fined him repeatedly until he finally gave up and paved over his garden beds. Across the street, a young couple named David and Lisa Nguyen told me that Patricia had reported them to code enforcement for having their garbage cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though they had only rolled them out an hour early. They had been fined by both the HOA and the city. Another neighbor, Sandra Willis, said that Patricia had tried to force her to repaint her house because the color was supposedly not on the approved list, even though Sandra had painted it the exact same color it had been when she bought it 5 years earlier. Sandra had ultimately spent $3,000 repainting her entire house just to avoid the mounting fines and legal threats. The stories went on and on. Patricia Harrington had made herself the queen of Meadowbrook Estates, and she ruled with an iron fist. Most people were afraid to stand up to her because fighting the HOA meant legal fees and hassle. People had jobs and families and did not have the time or money to battle over every petty rule. But what Patricia had done to my trees was not petty. This was different. This was major property destruction, and I was not going to let it go. 3 weeks after the trees were cut down, Michael filed our lawsuit in Mecklenburg County Superior Court. We sued the HOA, Patricia Harrington personally, and the tree removal company that had performed the work. We were seeking $200,000 in damages based on Robert Davidson's Arborist report, plus attorney fees, court costs, and punitive damages. The lawsuit alleged trespass, destruction of property, fraud in the notice process, and exceeding the scope of authority granted under the HOA covenant. Michael had thoroughly reviewed the covenant documents, and while there was a section about maintaining community standards, there was nothing that gave the HOA the authority to remove mature, healthy trees from someone's property without their consent. The covenant allowed the HOA to request removal of dead or dangerous trees, but my trees had been neither. The local news got wind of the lawsuit, and suddenly, I was doing interviews with reporters. A local NBC affiliate came out and filmed my stumps and interviewed me in my front yard. The story ran on the evening news with the headline, "Homeowner Sues HOA for $200,000 after trees cut down without permission." The publicity was both good and bad. On one hand, it put pressure on the HOA and made it harder for them to just dismiss me as one disgruntled homeowner. On the other hand, Patricia Harrington went into overdrive trying to defend herself and paint me as the villain. She sent a letter to every homeowner in Meadowbrook Estates, claiming that I was a troublemaker who refused to follow community rules and that my lawsuit was frivolous and would cost the HOA money that would ultimately come out of everyone's dues. She accused me of being selfish and not caring about property values or community standards, but her letter backfired. After people saw the news coverage and heard my side of the story, many of my neighbors started reaching out to me. Some of them offered to testify about their own negative experiences with Patricia and the HOA. Others simply offered support and told me they hoped I won. A group of about 15 homeowners even started attending HOA meetings to voice their displeasure with how the situation had been handled. At one particularly heated meeting that I attended, a man named Gregory Thompson stood up and demanded Patricia's resignation. "You have overstepped your authority," Gregory said, his voice shaking with anger. "You destroyed this man's property without proper authorization, and now you are trying to make all of us pay for your mistake. You need to step down." Patricia's face turned red. "I acted within my authority as HOA president. The board approved the tree removal." "Did the board know that you had falsified the notice delivery?" Someone else shouted from the back. The meeting devolved into chaos, with people yelling and arguing. Patricia eventually stormed out, and the remaining board members called for order. By the end of the meeting, 2 of the 5 board members had resigned, apparently not wanting to be associated with the lawsuit or Patricia's actions. As we moved toward trial, Michael deposed Patricia, the other HOA board members, and the tree removal company. The depositions revealed some damaging information. The tree removal company admitted that they had been uncomfortable with the job because I was not present and had not signed any authorization. But Patricia had assured them that the HOA had the legal authority to order the work. The company owner said that Patricia had been pushy and insistent, and they had relied on her representation that everything was legitimate. The other HOA board members admitted under oath that Patricia had not shown them the actual Arborist report or given them full details about the trees. She had simply told them that my trees were non-compliant and needed to be removed, and the board had voted to approve the action based on her recommendation. None of them had actually visited my property to look at the trees themselves. Most damaging was Patricia's own deposition. Michael was brilliant in how he questioned her. He got her to admit that she had personally disliked the look of my trees because they blocked the view of my house from the street. He got her to admit that there was nothing actually wrong with the trees, no disease or danger. He got her to admit that she had arranged for the notice letters to be signed by an HOA employee, rather than ensuring they were actually delivered to me. When Michael asked her why she had not simply called me or knocked on my door to discuss the issue, Patricia had no good answer. She stumbled over her words and finally said something about following proper procedures, but it was obvious to everyone in the room that she had intentionally avoided giving me real notice because she knew I would fight the tree removal. As the trial date approached, the HOA's insurance company started making noise about settling. Their attorney reached out to Michael with an initial offer of $50,000. Michael told them to go back to their client because we were not interested in lowball offers. 2 weeks later, they came back with $80,000. Michael countered at $175,000 plus attorney fees. We were playing hardball, and I was fine with it. I wanted Patricia and the HOA to face real consequences for what they had done. The insurance company balked at our counteroffer, and we continued preparing for trial. Robert Davidson had completed his comprehensive Arborist report, and it was a thing of beauty. 50 pages of detailed analysis, photographs, measurements, and calculations. He had used multiple valuation methods, and they all came to similar conclusions. The trees that had been destroyed had a combined value of approximately $185,000. The report broke down the value of each individual tree, explained the methodology, cited industry standards and legal precedents, and included a detailed analysis of the impact on my property value. Robert explained that mature trees of that size and age increased property values significantly by providing shade, curb appeal, privacy, and environmental benefits. Losing them would make my property less desirable and harder to sell. Michael also retained a real estate appraiser who compared my house to similar properties in the neighborhood. The appraiser concluded that the loss of the trees had decreased my property value by at least $40,000. Between the tree value itself and the property value impact, we had solid documentation supporting our $200,000 claim. The trial was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in September, about 5 months after my trees had been cut down. I took the day off work and put on my best suit. Michael had prepared me extensively for what to expect. I would be called to testify, and the HOA's attorney would try to paint me as an unreasonable homeowner who ignored legitimate community rules. The courtroom was more formal than I expected. Judge William Harrison presided, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. The jury consisted of 7 people, as was standard for civil cases in North Carolina. 4 women and 3 men, ranging in age from late 20s to probably early 70s. Michael gave his opening statement, laying out our case clearly and methodically. He explained that the HOA had exceeded its authority, failed to provide proper notice, and destroyed valuable property without authorization. He told the jury that we would prove the trees had been worth approximately $185,000, and that the HOA needed to be held accountable for its actions. The HOA's attorney, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, gave her opening statement painting a picture of a reasonable HOA trying to maintain community standards against a difficult homeowner who refused to comply with rules. She claimed that proper notice had been given and that the HOA had acted within its authority under the covenant. I was the first witness called. Michael walked me through the entire timeline, from coming home to find my trees gone, to calling the police, to hiring experts and filing the lawsuit. I explained how much the trees had meant to me, both for practical reasons like shade and energy costs, and for personal reasons like my mother's Japanese maple. Jennifer Walsh Cross examined me aggressively. She tried to get me to admit that I had ignored HOA communications in the past. She asked if I had attended HOA meetings. She suggested that I was just being difficult and refusing to follow reasonable community rules, but I stayed calm and stuck to the facts. I had never received any notices about my trees. I had never been told there was any problem with them. I had never been given any opportunity to contest the issue or seek alternatives. And most importantly, the trees had been healthy and valuable, not dead or dangerous. The HOA called Patricia Harrington as their first witness. She looked nervous on the stand, fidgeting with her hands and avoiding eye contact with the jury. Jennifer Walsh tried to rehabilitate Patricia's deposition testimony, but Patricia made things worse by coming across as defensive and evasive. When Michael Cross examined her, he methodically dismantled her credibility. He showed the jury the notice tracking information proving that the letters had been signed by an HOA employee, not delivered to me. He showed emails where Patricia had discussed her dislike of my trees with other board members. He got her to admit that she had pushed for the removal despite other board members suggesting they should wait and try to contact me directly. By the time Patricia left the stand, she looked defeated. I could see several jury members looking at her with obvious disapproval. The absolute star of the trial, though, was Robert Davidson. He took the stand on the second day of trial and spent nearly 3 hours explaining his findings. He brought enlarged photographs of the tree stumps showing the healthy growth rings. He explained the trunk formula method of tree valuation, which was the industry standard. He walked through each tree individually, explaining its species, age, health, and value. Michael had Robert explain the concept of replacement value versus actual tree value. A 90-year-old oak tree could not truly be replaced. You could plant a new oak tree, but it would take nearly a century to reach the same size and maturity. That was why the valuation methods took into account not just the cost of buying and planting a new tree, but the lost value of the mature specimen. Jennifer Walsh tried to challenge Robert's methodology and suggest that his valuations were inflated, but Robert was unflappable. He had decades of experience, professional certifications, and had testified as an expert witness in numerous cases. He explained that his methods were conservative and well accepted in the industry. He cited legal precedents where courts had accepted similar valuations. He was professional, knowledgeable, and completely credible. I could see the jury members taking extensive notes during Robert's testimony. One woman in the front row was shaking her head in disapproval when she looked at the photographs of my destroyed trees. The HOA also called their own expert, an arborist from a different company who tried to argue that the trees had been worth much less. But under cross-examination, Michael got this expert to admit that he had not actually visited my property before the trees were removed and was basing his opinions solely on photographs. He also got the expert to admit that healthy, mature oak trees of the size Robert had documented were indeed valuable specimens. After 3 days of testimony, both sides gave their closing arguments. Michael was passionate and compelling, urging the jury to hold the HOA accountable for its wrongful destruction of my property. He reminded them that property rights were fundamental and that HOAs could not be allowed to exceed their authority and destroy valuable property without consequences. Jennifer Walsh tried to appeal to the jury's sympathy for the HOA, suggesting that a large judgment would hurt all the homeowners who would have to pay increased dues. But Michael had already addressed this in his closing, pointing out that the HOA had insurance for exactly this type of situation, and that the insurance company would be paying the judgment, not individual homeowners. The jury deliberated for about 5 hours before reaching a verdict. When we were called back into the courtroom, My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man who worked as an accountant, stood to read the verdict. In the matter of James Erikson versus Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, we the jury find in favor of the plaintiff. We award damages in the amount of $192,000 for the value of the destroyed trees and property value impact. We further award $53,000 in punitive damages. We find that the defendant's actions were willful and taken in bad faith, and we recommend that the plaintiff's attorney fees and court costs be paid by the defendant. I felt my knees go weak with relief. Michael put a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "We won." The total judgment was $245,000 plus attorney fees and costs. It was more than we had even asked for. The jury had clearly been offended by what the HOA had done and wanted to send a strong message. Judge Harrison thanked the jury and entered the judgment. He also ruled that the HOA would be responsible for paying Michael's attorney fees and all court costs, which would add probably another $50,000 to what they owed. As we left the courtroom, reporters were waiting outside. I gave a brief statement saying that I was grateful for the jury's decision and hoped this would send a message that HOAs could not exceed their authority and destroy people's property without accountability. The story ran on the evening news again, this time with the headline "Jury awards homeowner nearly $300,000 after HOA illegally cut down trees." The figure included the judgment plus attorney fees. The fallout was swift. The HOA's insurance company paid the judgment within 30 days. Patricia Harrington resigned as HOA president immediately after the verdict, and she ended up moving out of the neighborhood entirely within a few months. Rumor had it that she was facing social ostracism from other homeowners who were furious about the whole situation. The remaining HOA board members issued a formal apology to me and to the neighborhood. They hired a new management company and completely revised their procedures to ensure that nothing like this could happen again. They also amended the covenant to clarify the limits of HOA authority and to add additional protections for homeowners. But the story did not end there. About 2 months after the trial, I got a call from a detective with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Detective Rachel Murphy asked if she could come by to talk to me about the HOA case. When she arrived, she explained that the district attorney's office had been reviewing the case and had concerns about potential criminal fraud charges related to the falsified notices. The intentional circumventing of the notice requirement by having an HOA employee sign for certified mail that was supposed to be delivered to me could potentially constitute fraud or forgery. "We are considering bringing criminal charges against Patricia Harrington," Detective Murphy said. The civil case made it clear that she intentionally arranged for the notices to be signed by someone else so that you would not actually receive them. That goes beyond a civil matter. That is potentially criminal fraud. I gave Detective Murphy all the documentation I had, including the deposition transcripts and the evidence Michael had gathered about the fraudulent notice process. 2 months later, in December, Patricia Harrington was arrested and charged with fraud and criminal conspiracy. The charges related not just to my case, but to 2 other situations where investigators found that Patricia had used similar tactics to avoid giving proper notice to homeowners before taking enforcement actions. The criminal case moved slowly through the system, but eventually, Patricia pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation, community service, and a requirement that she never serve on an HOA board again. She also had to pay restitution to the other homeowners who had been affected by her fraudulent actions. As for me, I used part of the settlement money to have large trees planted in my yard. They were not the same as the century-old oaks I had lost, but I worked with a specialty nursery that installed several large specimen trees, the biggest they could transport and plant. I got oak trees again, but these were already 30 feet tall and probably 20 years old. I also had a new Japanese maple planted in honor of my mother, this one even more beautiful than the one that had been destroyed. The rest of the money went into savings and investments. I had learned an expensive lesson about the importance of being involved in my HOA and not just ignoring what was happening in my community. I started attending every HOA meeting and even ran for the board of directors. I won a seat and worked with the other new board members to create a more transparent and reasonable HOA that actually served the homeowners instead of terrorizing them. Frank Morrison, my elderly neighbor, was able to plant his vegetable garden again. David and Lisa Nguyen stopped living in fear of petty violations. Sandra Willis never had to worry about her house paint color again. The neighborhood became a much more pleasant place to live once Patricia Harrington was gone, and the HOA reformed its practices. I still think about my old trees sometimes, especially on hot summer days when the shade is not quite as complete as it used to be. The new trees are growing and will eventually provide good coverage, but it will take years. Every time I look at the trees, though, I am reminded that standing up for yourself matters. Fighting back against injustice matters. Holding people accountable for their actions matters. A lot of my neighbors have told me that they were inspired by my willingness to fight the HOA in court. Several of them have become more active in neighborhood governance. The entire culture of Meadowbrook Estates changed because one person decided to stand up and say that what happened was wrong and unacceptable. Would I rather have my original trees back? Of course. No amount of money can truly replace a 90-year-old oak tree or a Japanese maple that my mother gave me. But I got justice, and sometimes that is all you can hope for. The HOA learned that they could not just do whatever they wanted without consequences. Patricia Harrington learned that fraud and abuse of power could lead to criminal charges. And I learned that even when something terrible happens, you can fight back and win. The legal fees had been significant, even though Michael took the case on contingency, and his portion came out of the settlement. But having a good lawyer who knew what he was doing made all the difference. Michael Chen was worth every penny. Robert Davidson's expert testimony was worth every penny. Doing things right and building a solid case was what won the day. I also learned about HOA law in North Carolina, probably more than I ever wanted to know. HOAs in our state have significant power, but that power is not unlimited. They have to follow their own governing documents. They have to provide proper notice. They have to act in good faith. And they can be held accountable when they fail to do these things. My case ended up being cited in several legal articles, and even in a couple of subsequent HOA disputes in North Carolina. Apparently, it set some useful precedent about the limits of HOA authority and the importance of proper notice procedures. Michael told me that several attorneys had contacted him asking about the case and using it as a reference in their own HOA disputes. One unexpected benefit of the whole ordeal was that I became much closer with my neighbors. Going through something like that tends to bring people together. Frank Morrison and I became good friends, and I helped him with his vegetable garden. David and Lisa Nguyen had me over for dinner several times. Sandra Willis organized a neighborhood block party, and it felt like the community had genuinely improved. On the 1-year anniversary of the day my trees were cut down, I held a tree planting ceremony in my yard. I invited all my neighbors, and we planted a commemorative oak tree together. I gave a short speech thanking everyone for their support during the legal battle and expressing hope that our neighborhood would continue to be a place where people looked out for each other and stood up against abuse of power. As I stood in my yard surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, looking at the new trees that were slowly growing and thriving, I felt a sense of peace. What Patricia Harrington and the HOA had done was terrible, and I would never fully get over the loss of those magnificent old trees. But I had fought back. I had won, and I had helped make my neighborhood a better place in the process. The stumps of the old trees were still visible in a few places where they had been ground down but not completely removed. I decided to leave them as a reminder. Some of my neighbors thought I was crazy for not having them fully removed, but to me, they served as a memorial of sorts. A reminder of what had been lost, but also a reminder of the fight and the victory that followed. I never saw Patricia Harrington again after the trial. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to a different part of Charlotte and was keeping a very low profile. Her criminal conviction had been reported in the news, and her reputation was thoroughly destroyed. I did not take any pleasure in her downfall, but I did feel that justice had been served. The tree removal company that had actually cut down my trees ended up settling with me separately for a small amount to avoid further litigation. They admitted that they should have insisted on seeing authorization directly from me before doing the work, and they changed their internal policies to prevent similar situations in the future. Looking back on the whole experience now, months later, I can see how it changed me. I became more assertive and more willing to stand up for myself. I became more involved in my community. I learned about the legal system and how important it is to document everything and build a solid case. I learned that sometimes you have to fight battles that seem overwhelming, but that doing so can lead to positive change not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. My property value actually ended up recovering despite the loss of the trees, partly because the large specimen trees I had installed were impressive in their own right, and partly because the publicity from the case made my house somewhat famous in the neighborhood. When I eventually do sell someday, I will probably get a premium just for being that house where the guy beat the HOA. The $245,000 judgment was significant, but more important to me was the principle of the thing. Patricia Harrington and the HOA had violated my rights, destroyed my property, and tried to make me pay for it. They had acted with arrogance and impunity, assuming that I would just roll over and accept what they had done. Standing up to them and winning sent a message that resonated far beyond just my case. I still serve on the HOA board, and we have worked hard to make Meadowbrook Estates a model for how an HOA should operate. We focus on genuinely important issues like maintaining common areas and enforcing rules that actually matter for safety and property values. We do not waste time on petty violations or arbitrary aesthetic standards. We communicate openly with homeowners and make sure everyone has a voice. The neighborhood has thrived under this new approach. Property values have gone up. People are friendlier and more engaged. The annual HOA meetings actually have good attendance now because people are not afraid of being ambushed with fines and violations. We even started a neighborhood social committee that organizes events and activities to bring people together. Every time I walk out my front door and see my new trees growing strong and healthy, I am reminded that good things can come from terrible situations. Those trees represent resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for what is right. They may not be the century-old oaks that were wrongfully destroyed, but they are beautiful in their own way, and they carry their own significance. The Japanese maple that I planted in honor of my mother has grown beautifully. It blooms every spring with delicate red leaves that turn brilliant shades of orange and red in the fall. I sit on my back deck sometimes and look at that tree, thinking about my mom and how she would have been proud of me for fighting back against the HOA. She always taught me to stand up for myself and not let people push me around. I think I finally learned that lesson. As I write this now, sitting on that same deck on a beautiful Carolina evening, I can hear kids playing in the neighborhood and smell someone grilling dinner. My new trees rustle in the breeze, providing shade and beauty just like the old ones did. The nightmare of coming home to find my trees destroyed feels like it happened in another lifetime, even though it has only been about a year and a half. The experience taught me that homeownership comes with responsibilities, including the responsibility to be engaged and informed about what is happening in your community. It taught me that HOAs can be forces for good or for ill, depending on who is running them and what their priorities are. And it taught me that the legal system, while imperfect and often slow, can deliver justice when you have the courage to use it and the patience to see it through. Would I go through it all again? Absolutely not. It was stressful, expensive in terms of time and emotional energy, and painful to lose trees that had been part of my home for so long. But I am glad I fought back. I am glad I did not just accept what happened and move on. I am glad I held Patricia Harrington and the HOA accountable for their actions. The $245,000 in damages, plus attorney fees, sent a clear message that actions have consequences. The criminal charges against Patricia reinforced that message even more strongly. And the changes in how our HOA operates show that real, lasting positive change is possible when people stand up and demand better. My story has been shared in HOA horror story forums online, in legal circles, and even in some real estate continuing education courses, as an example of what can go wrong when HOAs exceed their authority. I have been contacted by other homeowners facing similar issues, asking for advice on how to fight back against overreaching HOAs. I always tell them the same thing: document everything, get expert opinions, hire a good lawyer, and do not give up. The legal precedent from my case has been useful in other situations. Michael Chen told me that he has used elements of our case in several subsequent HOA disputes, and he has won favorable outcomes for other clients. The principle that HOAs must provide genuine notice, must act within their actual authority, and can be held liable for exceeding that authority, has been reinforced through my case and others that followed. I think about the what-ifs sometimes. What if I had not fought back? What if I had just accepted the destruction of my trees and paid the $4,500 they demanded? Patricia Harrington would still be terrorizing the neighborhood. The HOA would still be operating without any real accountability. My trees would still be gone, but I would have gotten nothing in return. Instead, I fought. I won. And I made a difference not just for myself, but for my entire community. That is worth more than any amount of money, though I will admit the $245,000 was pretty satisfying too. As the sun sets over my neighborhood this evening, casting long shadows from my new trees across the lawn, I feel grateful. Grateful for the justice system that worked as it should. Grateful for the experts like Robert Davidson and the attorney Michael Chen who helped me build my case. Grateful for neighbors who supported me and stood by me through the fight. And grateful for the lessons learned through one of the most difficult experiences of my life. My trees are growing. My neighborhood is thriving. And justice was served. Sometimes, that is the best ending you can hope for.